Before there was Tyler Perry's Madea or Martin Lawrence's Sheneneh, there was Geraldine Jones and the groundbreaking variety show that made history while hiding some bizarre secrets. From NBC censors ordering breast reductions to a catchphrase that accidentally named computer software, The Flip Wilson Show was far stranger behind the scenes than audiences ever imagined during its 4-year reign as TV's second most watched program. Fact 1. Flip Wilson was one of 18 to 24 children. Before Flip Wilson became one of the biggest names in television history, he came from one of the most remarkably large families anyone could imagine. Born Claro Wilson Jr. on December 8, 1933, in Jersey City, New Jersey, he entered a household that was already bursting at the seams with siblings. The exact number of children in the Wilson family has become a source of confusion over the decades, with different sources reporting wildly different figures. Some biographies claim he was one of 10 children, while others state there were 18 kids in total, and still others insist the number reached as high as 24 children born to the same mother and father. What makes this even more remarkable is that all these children were born to Claro Wilson Sr. and Cornelia Bullock during one of the hardest periods in American history. The Great Depression had devastated the country, and the Wilson family was struggling in extreme poverty. Flip's father worked as a handyman, but because of the economic collapse, steady work was nearly impossible to find. The family's situation was so dire that they sometimes lived in conditions most people today would find unimaginable, including at one point residing in a coal cellar. Most historical accounts settle on 18 children as the most likely accurate number, with 18 surviving into adulthood. This staggering family size meant that resources were stretched impossibly thin. When Flip was just 7 years old, his mother, Cornelia, abandoned the family entirely, unable to cope with the overwhelming burden of caring for so many children in such desperate poverty. His father, left alone with more kids than he could possibly manage, had no choice but to place many of them, including young Flip, into foster care. This massive family and its collapse would shape everything about Flip Wilson's early life and eventual path to stardom. Fact 2. He enlisted at 16 by lying about his age. After his mother abandoned the family and his father placed him in foster care, young Flip Wilson's childhood became a series of unstable living situations that would have broken most kids. He bounced from one foster home to another, running away repeatedly because he desperately wanted to get back to his father in Jersey City. Some of the foster parents were kind and caring, but others were only interested in cashing the foster care checks and would give his food to their own children instead. Eventually, Wilson ended up in reform school where he experienced something he'd never had before, his very first birthday celebration. A teacher gave him a can of shoe polish and a box of Cracker Jacks, which became the first birthday gifts he had ever received in his life. At just 16 years old in 1950, Wilson made a bold decision that would change everything. He lied about his age and enlisted in the United States Air Force, even though he was far too young to legally join the military. This wasn't uncommon during that era, as many young men saw the armed forces as their only escape from poverty, but it was still a risky move. What happened next was completely unexpected. Wilson's outgoing personality and natural talent for telling funny, outrageous stories made him incredibly popular with his fellow servicemen. The young airman didn't just entertain the guys in his own unit. His reputation spread so quickly that his commanding officers made an unusual decision. They actually began sending him from airbase to airbase specifically to perform for other servicemen and boost their morale. The military essentially turned him into a traveling entertainer years before he would ever step foot on a professional stage. This 4-year period in the Air Force became Wilson's informal comedy school, where he learned how to read audiences and perfect his storytelling craft. Fact 3. Flip came from being flipped out. Most entertainers spend years carefully crafting their stage names, testing different options, and deliberating over what will sound catchy and memorable to audiences. Flip Wilson never had to worry about any of that because his iconic name came from a completely spontaneous moment among friends in the military. His birth name was Claro Wilson Jr., which wasn't exactly the kind of name that would look great on a marquee or sound natural rolling off Johnny Carson's tongue during an introduction. But the name Flip wasn't something he invented for show business at all. It was a nickname that his fellow airmen gave him during his time in the United States Air Force. The guys in his barracks noticed something unique about the young serviceman from Jersey City. Wilson had this incredibly energetic, wild personality that set him apart from everyone else on base. He would tell these elaborate, crazy stories that were so animated and over the top that his buddies started saying he was always flipped out or flipping out with his wild antics and unpredictable behavior. The phrase flipped out was popular slang at the time for someone who was acting crazy or losing their cool in an entertaining way. His barracks mates started calling him Flip as a shortened version of flipped out, and the nickname stuck so completely that it basically replaced his given name. When Wilson was discharged from the Air Force in 1954 and started pursuing comedy professionally, he didn't even consider using his birth name Claro for his career. The name Flip had become so much a part of his identity that it was the obvious choice for his stage name. It perfectly captured his energetic, unpredictable comedy style and had a snappy, memorable sound that audiences would remember. That random nickname from his military buddies ended up defining his entire professional identity for the rest of his life. Fact 4. NBC censors demanded a smaller bust for Geraldine. When Flip Wilson debuted his most famous character, Geraldine Jones, on the Flip Wilson special in September of 1969, audiences absolutely loved the sassy, confident woman who didn't take nonsense from anyone. The character was an instant hit with viewers across the country, but not everyone at the network was thrilled with every aspect of Geraldine's appearance. After that first special aired to massive ratings, Wilson received some unexpected feedback from NBC Standards and Practices, which was the department responsible for making sure everything on the network met their guidelines for appropriate content. The network executives had a specific concern about Geraldine's physical appearance, and they didn't hesitate to bring it up directly with Wilson. They asked him to reduce the size of Geraldine's bust for all future appearances on television. This wasn't a suggestion or a gentle recommendation, it was a clear request from the people who controlled what could and couldn't appear on NBC. The Standards and Practices Department was worried about propriety and what they considered appropriate for family viewing during primetime hours. They felt that Geraldine's figure was a bit too exaggerated and might be considered inappropriate or too provocative for the television audience of that era. Wilson agreed to their request without making a big fuss about it, understanding that he needed to maintain a good working relationship with the network if he wanted his show to succeed. For the regular series that launched in September of 1970 and throughout its 4-year run, Geraldine appeared with a more modest figure that satisfied the network censors. It's one of those behind-the-scenes details that most viewers never noticed, but it shows just how much control the networks had over every tiny detail of what appeared on screen, even down to the exact proportions of a comedy character's costume padding. Fact 5. Geraldine's catchphrase. Inspired computer technology, one of Geraldine Jones's most famous catchphrases was, "What you see is what you get," which she would deliver with attitude and confidence whenever someone questioned her or tried to change who she was. The line became so popular during the early 1970s that people across America were repeating it in everyday conversations, and it entered the national vocabulary as one of those phrases everyone instantly recognized. But the impact of this catchphrase went far beyond just pop culture and television history. It actually ended up playing a surprising role in the development of computer technology. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, computer engineers at Xerox PARC, which stands for Palo Alto Research Center, along with researchers at other technology companies, were working on a revolutionary new concept for text editing software. Before this innovation, people working on computers had to type in special codes and commands without really knowing how their documents would look when printed. The screen would show plain text with formatting codes, and you just had to hope everything would turn out right when you finally printed it. The engineers wanted to create a system where what appeared on your computer screen would match exactly what would come out of the printer, eliminating all that guesswork and frustration. These computer scientists needed a catchy name for this new technology. And someone remembered Geraldine's famous line from the Flip Wilson show. They took the phrase, "What you see is what you get," and turned it into the acronym WISIWYG, which is pronounced WYSIWYG in the tech world. This term became the standard way to describe text editing and design software that shows you an accurate preview of your final printed document. Every time someone uses that term in computing today, they're unknowingly referencing a drag character from a 1970s variety show. Fact 6. The show pioneered theater in the round format on TV. Most variety shows in the 1970s used traditional stage setups where the audience sat in front of the performers in rows like a regular theater, and the cameras filmed from specific angles that the audience never blocked. Flip Wilson and his producer Bob Henry decided to do something completely different that had never been attempted on a network variety show before. They created a theater in the round stage format, which meant the performance area was circular and placed right in the middle of the studio with audience members seated on all sides surrounding the action. This setup was revolutionary for television because it created all kinds of challenges that traditional stages didn't have. The performers had to constantly move and turn to face different sections of the audience so nobody felt left out, and the cameras had to be positioned carefully to capture the action without showing too much of the audience on the opposite side. Even more unusual, some audience members were actually seated behind the sketch sets on occasion, which meant they had partially obstructed views but were still part of the live studio experience. This wasn't considered a problem because Wilson and his team wanted to create an intimate, immersive feeling that made everyone in the studio feel like they were part of the show rather than just passive observers watching from a distance. The theater in the round format emphasized the talents of the performers rather than relying on elaborate sets and production numbers with big chorus lines and dancers. Wilson opened the very first episode by joking that there would be no expensive opening production number because it would have cost $104,000. So instead, he showed the audience a briefcase full of cash and asked if that wasn't better than watching a bunch of girls jumping around the stage. This stripped-down, performer-focused approach became a signature element that set the Flip Wilson show apart from every other variety program on television. Fact 7. Geraldine debuted. Opposite Jonathan Winters in drag. Geraldine Jones didn't just appear out of nowhere as a fully formed character. She made her very first appearance by name and in costume on Labor Day, September 1st, 1969, during the Flip Wilson special that NBC aired to test whether Wilson could carry his own series. The network and Wilson's team had put together this special carefully, and they made a brilliant choice about how to introduce what would become his most famous character to the American television audience. The sketch was set on an airplane, and it featured legendary comedian Jonathan Winters playing one of his own popular characters, an elderly woman named Maude Frickert, who had a sharp tongue and plenty of attitude. Winters was already dressed in full drag as this gray-haired older lady sitting in her airplane seat when Wilson's Geraldine character came walking down the aisle. Wilson was dressed as a stewardess in a loud-print miniskirt with a puffy cap on top of a bouffant flip hairdo topped by a pillbox hat. Geraldine sat down right next to Maude, and the comedic interaction between these two characters was immediately electric and hilarious. Wilson later explained that choosing Jonathan Winters for this debut was a very deliberate decision. Winters' Maude character was already well known to television audiences, so pairing Geraldine with an established character gave her instant credibility. But even more importantly, Wilson knew there would be multiple layers of comic tension built right into the scene. You had two men playing women, which was funny on its own. You had a clear generational difference, with Maude being an older woman and Geraldine being young and modern. And you had the racial difference between a white character and a black character interacting as equals, which was still relatively rare on television in 1969. The audience absolutely loved it, and apparently Winters met his match. Fact 8. Geraldine were $500 designer dresses. Most television shows would dress a comedy character in whatever cheap costume they could find or throw together quickly, especially when that character was essentially a joke and only appeared occasionally during the show. Flip Wilson had a completely different philosophy when it came to Geraldine Jones, and he insisted that she be dressed with the same care and expense as any leading lady on television. When Geraldine appeared on screen, she was wearing genuine haute couture from one of the most prestigious fashion designers in the world. The dresses that Geraldine wore were designed by Emilio Pucci, an Italian fashion designer whose work was worn by celebrities and wealthy socialites around the globe. Each dress cost $500, which might not sound shocking by today's standards, but in the early 1970s, that was an enormous amount of money to spend on a single outfit for a comedy sketch. To put that in perspective, $500 in 1970 would be equivalent to spending over $3,000 on a dress today. Geraldine also wore $50 shoes, which was another luxury expense for a character who was supposed to be a working-class woman from the South. The transformation into Geraldine was also a serious production that took real time and professional skill. Wilson couldn't just throw on a wig and dress and walk on. Fact 9. Wilson got his own sound stages. Mid-series. When The Flip Wilson Show first launched in September of 1970, it was treated like most other shows on the NBC network. The production had to share studio space with other television series that were filming at the same time, which meant they had to work around other shows' schedules and couldn't always have the studio exactly when they wanted it. This was standard practice in the television industry, where studio space was expensive and networks tried to maximize efficiency by having multiple productions use the same facilities on different days or at different times. But by the fall of 1972, something extraordinary happened that showed just how massive The Flip Wilson Show had become. Wilson's popularity had grown so enormous during the first 2 seasons that NBC made a decision that was virtually unprecedented for a variety show host. They gave Wilson and his production team their own dedicated set of sound stages that didn't have to be shared with any other shows. This meant they could keep sets standing between episodes, store props and costumes on site, and have complete control over their production schedule without worrying about conflicts with other programs. Getting your own sound stages was the kind of privilege usually reserved for the biggest stars in Hollywood or for long-running soap operas that needed permanent sets. For a variety show, which typically needed flexibility and constantly changing setups rather than permanent spaces, this was an incredible vote of confidence from the network. It also represented a significant financial investment from NBC, since dedicating entire sound stages to one show meant they couldn't generate additional revenue by renting that space to other productions. This level of production control gave Wilson unprecedented creative freedom and showed just how much power he had earned at the network through the show's incredible ratings success. Fact 10. Mahalia Jackson made one of her final performances on the show. The Flip Wilson Show featured some of the biggest musical talents in America during its 4-season run, but one appearance in late 1971 carried special historical significance that nobody fully understood at the time. Gospel legend Mahalia Jackson, who was often called the Queen of Gospel and was considered one of the most influential voices in American music, appeared on the show during the 2nd season. What made this performance so meaningful was that it turned out to be one of the very last times she would ever perform in public before her death. Jackson had an incredible career that spanned decades, and her powerful contralto voice had made her famous around the world. She had performed at major historical events, including singing at the March on Washington in 1963, where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous speech. By 1971, Jackson's health was declining, and she knew her time as a performer was coming to an end. She had traveled to Germany earlier that year to give a final concert, which she intended to be the official end of her performing career. When she returned to the United States after that concert in Germany, she made very few public appearances. Her decision to appear on The Flip Wilson Show was therefore significant because it meant she was choosing to make one of her final television appearances on a program hosted by an African-American entertainer. The show gave Jackson a platform to reach millions of viewers one last time. Just a few months after her appearance on the show, Mahalia Jackson passed away in January of 1972 at the age of 60. Her performance on The Flip Wilson Show remains preserved as one of the last times audiences got to experience her remarkable talent. Fact 11. Ed Sullivan told Wilson, "I'm going to make you a star." By the mid-1960s, Flip Wilson had been working his way up through the comedy ranks and had finally gotten his big break when Johnny Carson invited him onto The Tonight Show after comedian Red Fox told Carson that Wilson was the funniest comedian around. But Wilson would later say that an even bigger moment in his career came from his first appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, which was scheduled for November 13, 1966. This was an enormous opportunity because Sullivan's show was one of the most watched programs in America, and an appearance there could make or break a performer's career. Wilson was understandably nervous before his debut, and he was at the top of the stairs going over his material in his head, rehearsing his stories and trying to calm his nerves. Meanwhile, Ed Sullivan was downstairs walking through another door, and he kept looking up at Wilson standing there. Then Sullivan called out to him, saying, "Hey, kid, come here." Wilson looked around because he wasn't sure who Sullivan was talking to, but Sullivan clarified that he meant Wilson. When Wilson came downstairs, Sullivan put his hand on his shoulder and said something that Wilson would remember for the rest of his life. Sullivan told him, "Don't worry about it. You're going to be a star. I'm going to make you a star." Wilson appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show 11 times total, and even won Sullivan's Comedian of the Year award in 1970. Years later, Wilson would credit Ed Sullivan as providing the biggest boost to his career, which was remarkable considering how important the Tonight Show appearances had been. When Wilson finally got his own show, he asked Sullivan to be a guest on the very first episode as a way of thanking him for all his support. Fact 12. The show's cancellation was partly due to Wilson's salary demands. When The Flip Wilson Show ended its run in June of 1974 after 4 successful seasons, most people assumed it was simply because the ratings had declined like they had for most variety shows during that era. The truth behind the cancellation was actually more complicated and involved a combination of factors that went beyond just the audience numbers. While it's true that ratings across the entire variety show genre were beginning a terminal decline in the mid-1970s, there was another significant reason why NBC decided to pull the plug on Wilson's show. Throughout the show's run, Wilson had repeatedly demanded higher salary raises from the network, which was understandable given that he was hosting and starring in the second most popular show on television during its peak years. By 1972, Wilson was earning more than $1 million a year, which was an astronomical sum at that time. But Wilson felt he deserved even more money as the show continued, and he wasn't shy about making those demands known to NBC executives. The network began to resist his requests for larger salaries, and the ongoing salary negotiations created tension between Wilson and the people who controlled his show's budget. The combination of Wilson's repeated demands for higher raises and the show's slipping ratings in later seasons caused the series to go significantly over its budget. NBC had to make a business decision about whether it made financial sense to keep paying Wilson's increasing salary for a show whose audience was shrinking along with the rest of the variety show landscape. In the end, the network decided that the costs had become too high relative to the ratings, and they canceled the series. The final episode of The Flip Wilson Show aired on June 27, 1974, ending one of the most groundbreaking programs in television history. Fact 13. Wilson's Flip Wilson Handshake had a specific choreography. One of the most memorable and anticipated moments of every episode of The Flip Wilson Show happened right at the beginning when Flip would greet his celebrity guests. Instead of a simple handshake or hug like most talk show hosts would do, Wilson had created an elaborate greeting ritual that became known as the Flip Wilson Handshake. This wasn't just a casual, spontaneous gesture that changed from guest to guest. It was a precisely choreographed sequence of moves that followed the exact same pattern every single time. The handshake started with 4 quick hand slaps between Wilson and his guest, where they would slap their palms together in rapid succession. After those 4 hand slaps were completed, they would move on to the next part of the sequence, which involved 2 elbow bumps, where they would knock their elbows together. Finally, the greeting would finish with 2 hip bumps, where Wilson and his guest would turn slightly to the side and bump their hips together twice to complete the ritual. The entire sequence had to be performed with good timing and rhythm to look smooth and natural on camera. This complex greeting became such a signature element of the show that regular viewers would wait for it and sometimes even try to do it themselves at home. The handshake helped introduce a wider audience to the practice of prearranged complex handshakes that combine different types of physical contact beyond just shaking hands. Wilson performed this greeting with every guest who appeared on the show, whether they were musicians like James Brown and Aretha Franklin, comedians like Richard Pryor and George Carlin, or even athletes like Muhammad Ali and Bill Russell. The Flip Wilson handshake became so associated with the show that it was almost as famous as Geraldine's catchphrases. Fact 14. George Carlin was a writer and regular performer. George Carlin, who would later become one of the most famous and influential stand-up comedians in American history, had a unique dual role on The Flip Wilson Show that most viewers probably didn't fully realize when they watched the program. Carlin wasn't just a guest who showed up occasionally to perform his comedy routines. He was actually part of the show's writing staff and worked behind the scenes creating material for the program. At the same time, he also made frequent on-screen appearances as a performer, which meant he was contributing to the show in 2 completely different capacities. This arrangement gave Carlin an unusual amount of creative freedom and allowed him to develop his comedy in ways that wouldn't have been possible if he was just a regular guest performer. When Carlin appeared on camera, he would often perform his news, weather, sports, satire sketches, which involved him playing the role of a hip, irreverent newscaster who would deliver absurd takes on current events and mock the serious tone of real news programs. Wilson and Carlin would work together to expand and refine these sketches, building on the material that Carlin had originally developed and finding new angles and jokes to make them funnier. The collaboration between Wilson and Carlin was particularly valuable because they had different comedic styles and perspectives that complemented each other well. Wilson's storytelling approach and character-based comedy mixed effectively with Carlin's more observational and satirical style. Having Carlin as both a writer and performer meant that he could help shape the overall direction of the show's comedy while also getting valuable stage time on one of the most watched programs on television. This exposure on The Flip Wilson Show helped Carlin build his career during a crucial period when he was transitioning from being a relatively clean-cut comedian to the edgier counterculture icon he would eventually become. Fact 15. The Flip Wilson special was seen by 42% of all TV viewers. Before NBC would commit to giving Flip Wilson his own weekly series, they wanted to test whether he could actually carry a full hour of television and attract a large enough audience to justify the investment. The network put together the Flip Wilson special, which aired on September 1, 1969, as essentially a pilot episode to see how viewers would respond to Wilson as the host of his own show. What happened next exceeded everyone's expectations and proved that Wilson had something truly special that American audiences were eager to watch. The ratings for that special were absolutely extraordinary by any measure. 42% of all television viewers in the United States tuned in to watch the Flip Wilson special, which was an astonishing achievement for a variety special featuring a performer who had never hosted his own show before. To put that number in perspective, it meant that nearly half of everyone watching television that night had chosen to watch Flip Wilson. These weren't just good ratings, they were the kind of numbers that television executives dream about and rarely ever see. What made these ratings even more significant was what they revealed about Wilson's appeal beyond the traditional audience for black entertainers. Wilson had unprecedented crossover appeal with white audiences, which was still relatively rare in 1969. The special proved that Wilson's humor, characters, and personality could connect with viewers across racial lines in ways that previous black variety show hosts had struggled to achieve. NBC executives looked at those ratings and immediately knew they had a potential hit on their hands. The overwhelming success of the Flip Wilson special convinced the network to greenlight a full weekly series which debuted just over a year later in September of 1970 and quickly became the second most watched show on television.